Welcome along, my aspiring allies, and thank you for joining me on this most recent episode of the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. This is the show where we explore some of the more complex, complicated, or taboo topics, and we get comfortable with that fear of putting our foot in it. Now, today I am joined by Philip Grindell, and we are going to be talking all about workplace violence and hostility and threat management. And if that sounds scary, I mean, it is. But it isn't, I promise you. It's actually a really insightful conversation about how we can avoid some of the more big scale issues that might happen to us in our workplaces by paying attention to the small stuff. So Philip Grindell, he is an expert when it comes to protective intelligence, behavioural threat management and investigations. And he's been doing this for over 30 years. So he's worked for as a New Scotland Yard detective in the Met, and he has had special operations control and command as well. So he has a really unique background when it comes to kind of countering this unwanted attention that can happen in certain situations and from various sources. So he is really kind of well versed when it comes to protection and threat management, and he's even worked with people like the British royal family, military, and governments as well. So he is absolutely at the top of his game when it comes to understanding this stuff. So I was absolutely delighted when I met him at a networking conference a little while back. And when he started to introduce to me that his topic was threat management, I was like, this is interesting. Let's have a chat. But for me, what really stood out in our initial conversation, and then again in this conversation today, was the synchronicities that exist between creating an open and inclusive workplace culture where people are treated as humans and you build positive human connection with one another, the impact that can have when it comes to negating workplace hostility and reducing any kind of threat management that might be coming your way within the workplace. So we had a really fascinating discussion about this. And I'm really, really delighted to be able to share that with you. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode in whichever way works best for you. And please welcome my guest today, Philip Grindell, on the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. With that and also because I've moved house as well, so I'm in a different space, and if the blur's good, because if you look too closely everything's just like empty and weird, so I'm kind of like just trying to just subtly make it look like everything's
all. Yeah. Well, that's good though. It's a new fresh start, isn't it? New house and all that. It's nice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, feeling good. If it wasn't so bloody menopausal about everything else that's going on in the world. But that's
Listen, my wife's going through that, and it's every so often she says, "I think I'm really doing well, aren't I?" Yes, you are. Yeah.
Is the right answer.
Well, yeah. I mean, since she's gone into the HRT, I think it's been a lot better for her.
Yeah. I'm in the queue for that. So I can't wait. There is not to go too off tangent, but some days I feel like everything's okay, and then yesterday for me was just a particularly bad day, and I was just like, I just don't, intellectually I understand what's going on, and I know it's not me, and I know it's all in my head, and I know what's happening, and nothing's really wrong. But I was just like, I don't know if I want to kill myself or other people. I'm not quite sure.
I know, but I used to say to her, and I had a couple of girls when I was working who were going through the same thing. I used to say to them, just don't come in. If you're feeling that shit, just don't worry about it. Work from home. And I used to say to my wife, just have a day on the sofa, watch a bit of TV or crap TV or whatever else. But I think psychologically it's such an interesting thing because it's the end of a period of a woman's life in terms of being able to have children, etc. And I know friends of ours who said, no, never want kids, gone through the menopause and then really sad about not having kids. And you think, and it's, my wife hasn't had kids. We just weren't successful, and I know that's part of the impact of menopause, but I think very often people think about the physical impact and the psychological impact to some degree. They don't always recognize that seismic change in a woman's life, and men don't go through that. So why would we understand it, if you like? But so we can intellectually get it, but physically and mentally, just thinking, okay, now this is hard work.
It is. It's a full body experience, and it's so funny. And I was talking to someone yesterday about it, and they were saying how on a different podcast episode actually, and they were saying the definition of menopause is just simply the cessation of a menstrual cycle. And she's like, if only it was just that simple.
Yeah, I know.
And you're right, it's just this whole period of, yeah, your life has just been turned on its head. And it was so interesting to just hear a lot of the brain science around it as well, around like why it's just so devastating for, like, with guys, and your hormone levels change so gradually over time, but for women it's just like bam. Like,
Yeah. And what's
yeah,
also interesting is, quite often it coincides, if you have daughters, with the daughter coming into that phase of their
yeah,
life. So it's like a double whammy that,
yeah,
look what you've lost, sort of thing.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's vastly misunderstood, and I used to sort of watch with kind of horror when men used to sort of try and create this menopause or whatever it was called for men. And you think, no, we don't go through that.
And
We go through something when we're teenagers or whatever. Men, when you kind of, are you a boy or are you a man? There's this kind of transition, and in most cultures around the world, they go through a specific process to take them through from that. Which historically was often where kind of national service came in. Ironically, talking about that in the politics, but it's just yeah, I just because the world is run by men predominantly, it's just not even with sort of lots of chatter in the last couple of years from celebrities and politicians and everything else. I still don't think people really get it, particularly if you are single or you don't have children, and that may be a choice or otherwise. But even so, it's that point where you can't change your mind now, sort of thing. So I think there's so much more to it,
yeah,
um, and my wife said for about 18 months when she was is it
yep,
perimenopausal.
perimenopausal, yeah,
Oh, I
the
think I'm doing really
start of
well.
it
And I was like,
all.
well,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, bang, and it hit, and she had days where she was just, she's very upbeat, but she was days when she was just um just couldn't get her head around how she was feeling, and was,
Yeah.
nothing you do or say is going to change it. So, sit on the sofa, watch shit TV if that's what you want to
Yeah.
do, and don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. But that's so true, because you're not sad about something. It's
Yeah,
just your body's just
yeah,
really giving you a shit time, and you're just like,
yeah,
what's happening? Like, you're
yeah.
a
So,
spectator, like you're going
yeah.
slowly crazy.
So don't swim against the tide. Just go with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
Good. Yes. Well, thank you. But also, and just as a build on that, it's really fantastic to hear a man talking about menopause in that way. And I wish, like you were saying, it's not something that directly, impacts people that are not born with a female reproductive system, but it's good that you at least are engaged in that fashion, because it will impact everybody in some way, just by proximity to other human beings, right? And I think it's something that I do wish more people spoke about in that manner. So that was really refreshing,
Okay.
to hear you say that too. So thank you.
Good. Okay. Pleasure. Pleasure.
Yeah. But let's talk about threat management,
Yeah. Well, that is part of
which
it. Well, but you see, I wonder whether that falls into threat management because
mm,
because when we're talking about behavioral threat management, I guess we're already started and we're on our way now. So,
let's do
when
it.
we're talking about it, what we're actually looking for is changes in behavior.
Mm,
And if we're looking at it within the workplace and we're looking at sort of workplace behavior, etc., then a good deal of that is about having those conversations between colleagues or a manager and a colleague, etc., to say, listen, I've kind of noticed that there's a real, you're not yourself these days, or something, whatever that conversation looks like, because that's how you pick up on whether someone's behavior is changing because there's an external reason. My parents died, or my dog's died, or I've gone through a separation, or my child's just got a very bad illness,
yeah.
or I'm going through the menopause. Um, and you think, okay, well, how can we then work with you to sort of get you through all this, as opposed to someone who says, do you know what, I'm really angry about what's happened at work, which then's a red flag around, from the threat management perspective. But if we don't have those conversations, we are
Mm,
going to make assumptions around people. And threat management is not as complicated as people think it is. The first step in it, the early indicators, are changes in behavior. And so it's about having those conversations. And certainly, I think, my own experience in policing, I think managers and supervisors stopped doing that because they felt it was intrusive, or they felt it was, none of my business and all this. And I disagree with that perspective. I think if you're a manager or a supervisor, then you should care for the people around you. And part of that caring process is understanding, I wonder why they've changed, why their behavior's changed. I wonder why they're not performing how they used to. I wonder, and it's that, it's that kind of, Ted Lasso thing about being inquisitive rather than judgmental, and thinking, I wonder why they're not how they were. I wonder what's happening in their life.
Yeah.
And when we talk about workplace environments, we have to remember that 50% of kind of the workplace issues are external issues. So they're either something's happening outside the workplace, so a divorce, a separation, child management issues, or child custody issues, or something like that, where the aggrieved party or the perceived aggrieved party is going to come to the workplace because that's where they know their partner is. And therefore, with that comes hostility, potentially violence, all sorts of things. Or you've got angry customers and complaints. And, we were having a chat this morning with my in-laws who are here with us around the kind of decline in customer service in the UK and how poor customer service is generally. And there's some research a couple of months ago that came out that said that if you have AI managing your customer service, customers tend to be more satisfied than if you have a human.
Wow.
Because the humans have, or the AI doesn't have emotion. And so it's not bringing an emotional response, and it's not bringing anything with it into the conversation. And generally speaking, when I speak to people in customer service, they're useless. I mean, I've had some horrendous experiences over the last 4 or 5 months. Sometimes because, well, that's just policy. We can't do anything about it. But once upon a time, we had this thing where the customer came first. We don't now. Now it's, the customer's kind of almost irrelevant to many companies. And so that creates hostility, and we're seeing more hostility from customers and clients. And that can either be somebody being physically violent or physically aggressive, or someone going online on social media or something and absolutely slaughtering your reputation as an organization. So unless you're having those conversations as a supervisor or a manager, you're not going to pick up on some of those changes. And those changes are the precursor to bullying, to harassment, to threats, to violence, to stalking, to all those things that go on. And so rather than making kind of threat management about this elusive subject that's done by security professionals and all that sort of stuff, actually it's done by supervisors and managers at the first, and colleagues.
Yeah.
I've noticed you've been not yourself the last 3 weeks. There's something going on, then I can have those chats. That's threat management.
Yeah. And I find that fascinating, actually, because when you think, I can imagine anyone kind of listening to this thinking, gosh, workplace violence, threat management, this is like big topics, right? It sounds terrifying, but actually what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that we're talking about workplace culture, essentially, aren't we?
Yep.
Like, how are we creating a culture where humans can connect with one another so that we notice these things? And for me, as the way you've just said it, it feels a bit like a no-brainer. We're talking about like preventative activity so that you don't end up in a situation where workplace violence could be an outcome. You're really starting at the front and saying, how are we connecting with other human beings? And I completely agree with what you're saying. If you are in a leadership role, a people management role, supervisory position, like, you have got a responsibility to care about the people in your teams, and create those connections so that you do notice and you can address things when it's formulating, rather than maybe when it's somewhere down the line and you've really got someone who's gone past the point of being disgruntled or feeling aggrieved or whatever, and it ends up being something very significant that they have to call in someone like you to help them get it sorted.
Well, I think if we look at it, I kind of reverse engineer things. So if you look at it from the perspective where there is an issue, something's happened, something's gone catastrophically wrong, Normally at that time, a good number of people will say, yeah, he was always a bit weird, that bloke, or he was always
Right.
this, or she was always that. And so it's not like people didn't recognize it or people didn't see something or notice something. It's just they didn't tell anyone. And
Mm,
the research we've done around workplace violence, hostility, whatever the correct term is these days, it changes depending on where the moon is that there are 4 reasons why people don't report. And there's, there is statistical evidence that's saying roughly 3/4 of the incidents don't get reported, which is a real, when we think about in terms of what has been reported, it's roughly 9.1 million people per year involved.
right.
That's only 25% of what's actually happening. If we
Wow.
think about sexual harassment of females in the workplace, the data says it's around 60 odd percent. I would say it's more like 90 odd percent.
Yeah.
I don't know a woman who's not been sexually harassed at work
Yeah.
in some
Well,
capacity.
I mean, even if you think about it, there's a real debate currently kicking off. I'm seeing across social media regarding the comments of one person on LinkedIn around professional dress for women, and he was specifically speaking about like seeing nipples and how triggering and unprofessional it was. And that's really
Yeah,
kicked off a debate, hasn't it, around actually how are we objectifying women's bodies in the workplace?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
having these conversations. Yeah.
Well, we're going to have the conversation on me about what side do you dress then? We've noticed for a man, we've noticed that actually we think your trousers are too tight and it's a bit more revealing than it should be. And where do we stop then? But
Yeah.
you see, the point is that so few of the incidents that happen are reported. And they're not reported because, first and foremost, people aren't really sure what behaviors they should be reporting. What is inappropriate behavior?
Mm.
So what do I report? Do I report the fact that Chummy's trousers are too tight, and it's a bit offensive, and I feel like he's doing it on purpose or something or whatever?
Mm.
Or do I report the fact that actually someone's behavior's changed and I feel like they're really aggressive towards me now? Or is that just because I know they're going through a tough time? Do I just let that go? So what do we report? And then where do we report it? Because many companies think that is really clear, and it isn't always really clear, and it certainly isn't really clear to the people that want to know, where do I report this? I went and investigated or did a review, I suppose you could say, of a very large international bank, and it turns out they had 2 separate reporting systems. When I said, well, why do you have 2 systems? They were like, I don't know. Bear in mind, these are outsourced, so it's
Oh.
costing the organization money. Okay, so you've got 2 outsourced reporting systems. Yeah, yeah. So if there's this sort of scenario, they report here, and if there's this sort of scenario, they report there. Okay, and everyone knows that in the whole company. That if there's this scenario, well, I assume so. Okay, well, let's
Mm.
probably look at that because I can guarantee you they don't. But then okay, so what happens to those reports? What was interesting, HR thought security were dealing with it, and security thought HR were dealing with it. And what was actually happening is no one was dealing with it.
Mm.
So these reports that had just gone into a black hole, effectively, that was being outsourced and paid for, which means the reporters, some of whom were anonymous, fair play, but some of whom weren't, there was no feedback. So they just assumed
Mm.
nothing was happening, which was
Yeah.
correct, which goes on to the third element, which is people just don't trust the investigative process. Now, if there isn't an investigative process because no one's looking at it, then that's a good reason why.
Yeah.
But equally, are the people who are investigating actually qualified to investigate it? We assume that HR are qualified to investigate something. We assume security, because they're security, are qualified to investigate something. Well, are they? Have they actually been trained to investigate? Just because
Mm.
you're in security doesn't mean you're qualified to investigate something.
Mm-hmm.
So are they the right people? Is it an independent investigation? I've got a client that I'm working with at the moment who's been subjected to stalking in a huge organization. And part of the reason that I'm doing it is because the person that is being stalked doesn't feel that it'll be dealt with independently within the organization. The organization will be actually looking out for itself first and
Mm.
foremost. How do we protect our reputation around this? And
Yeah.
then worrying about the safety of the person. So
Yeah.
this independent thing. And then the last phase is they fear repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
So if I report my concerns, are they going to get told it's me? if I report those concerns, am I going to get suspended, as in the complainant from Red Bull Racing? Am I going to be ostracized? Am I going to be outed? And am I going to be treated differently? Am I not going to get promoted? So, we have all these fears, and many of them will not be accurate, but it's the perception of the people who are not reporting, which is the vast majority. So we need to change those elements of it, because early indication, early identifiers of bad behavior or changing behavior will always, or some of those will always lead to really serious cases. Not all of them. Some of them will be management issues. Actually, can you go and have a word with so he probably doesn't realize, but actually his behavior is not acceptable. Yep, no problem. Leave it me. He's only just been promoted. I think he's probably not really come to terms of being in a position of leadership now, and he's he thinks he's got to behave in a way that he doesn't. I'll deal with that. Great. As opposed to, we need to investigate so and so's behavior. He's actually becoming threatening and harassing and all that sort of stuff. But again, it starts with a conversation, and I think the message I'm trying to get through, and I hope I have, is threat assessment. We shouldn't leave it to become a threat. We should deal with it early doors. It's everyone's responsibility. But then we've got internal cultures within an organization where things are different. So if you're working in the complaints department or customer service department, are you recognizing the duty of care of employees who are constantly getting battered every day on the telephone or on the internet, or however your process works with customers and clients? When I work for the politicians, we would say to MPs, a lot of people don't realize MPs don't look at their social media. MPs don't do their social media. They have someone does it for them. Now, some of them will have a quick look, but they don't make postings. They don't do anything. They don't read their mail. It all comes into their staff. So actually, it's their staff who are getting the abuse and the threats and all the nasty images and everything else. And we used to protect some of the MPs, particularly. Currently today, Diane Abbott is in the news. She wouldn't see anything. We'd made sure she didn't see anything because it was so offensive. But then we've got to deal with the people who are seeing it. Okay, so what impact is that having on these people? So culturally, within an organization, different departments will have different aspects of what they're dealing with. I worked on a child abuse team. Managed a child abuse team. So we would have a very set process about how many hours a day someone could look at certain material. We had psychological assessments every year. And that didn't happen across the police, just happened to our team and a couple of other teams involved in similar things. So you've got to have a bespoke response within an organization around where are our organization, where are our people vulnerable to hostility? How do we manage that? Because it may not be workplace violence to you, but it's hostility. And if your customer services team are going home every day battered from that, how's that impacting on their family life or their other life and or their performance or desire to do their job? Are they going to snap after 6 hours at somebody because they've had 6 hours of, your rubbish and all this sort of stuff? That's a very different experience to maybe someone who works in a different department, who it's all sunshine and flowers and thinks, I don't know what the problem is. I have a great time at work. So we need to look at it. We can't just look at it holistically and say, oh no, everything's perfect. We need to pick out the areas of vulnerability and think, here's an issue we need to worry about. And actually what you do is you create a risk register. So that actually within your risk register, you've identified all your various departments and worked out which ones are at more risk than others and why are they at more risk and what are you doing about it? Your frontline workers, if you're working in Burger King, the people who are serving the customers are more likely to get abuse and threats and violence than the chef at the back who's actually cooking the food. So how do we differentiate and deal with these different risks? Well, firstly, you've got to identify them.
Definitely.
And that's the same in every organization.
And what level of, I guess, awareness do you feel that the people making those decisions and creating those risk kind of assessments and risk registers would need as well, and specifically around people from like marginalized communities or with marginalized identities? Because I can imagine that there's probably some sort of correlation between identity characteristics and the types of hostility that you are on the receiving end of.
Yeah, and equally, I spoke to a lawyer yesterday who just said to me, look, my background is Irish, West Indian. And she said, if you've ever seen two West Indian people have a go at each other, which I have, I worked in Brixton for a number of years, But if you have, it looks really hostile,
Mm.
but that's just a cultural way of sometimes how they speak to each other in terms of when they're having a heated conversation. So we have to factor in lots of, the workplace is so complex and complicated. We've got, a whole generation of younger people now who have a very different relationship with work than my generation did. And they have different expectations and sense of entitlements about what you can and can't require of them within the workplace. You've then got a much more multicultural workplace with different religions and different races who will celebrate different days in different ways. And yet we're set up as a Christian country to have bank holidays and Christmas and everything else. And I'm not suggesting that's wrong, but how do we actually recognize other cultures, religious days within the calendar year as well? And actually, certainly when I was in the police, I know that sometimes people of certain religions would say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll work at Christmas or Easter because it doesn't have any impact on me. It means nothing to me, but can I have these days off? And you say, yeah, of course you can. So we'll flip that around. And so it's about a little bit of open-mindedness. But then we come into obviously people who are from marginalized communities, whether that's, sexually, racially, culturally, whatever. The workplace is so multi-dimensional now that if you try to factor in everything, I think it would become overly bureaucratic. So it comes back to the human connection around understanding each other and leaders enabling managers to have flexibility about how they manage their teams. Do I need to write a detailed docket about why I'm letting this person work from home on certain days when they're going through a certain thing? Or can I just actually have an email correspondence with them saying, look, you've said this to me, we've agreed this. These are the kind of, agreements, job done. CCHR in, that's it. We don't need a report and everything else. We've just got a nice agreement here. Very easy, job done. Or the legal department going to get in and say, no, I need a new contract of employment and I need this. I don't know. But I think we overcomplicate things sometimes. I know whenever I was managing people, we'd have a conversation, we'd send an email out to each other saying, this is what we've discussed, this is what we've agreed. Yeah, I've agreed that. That's really good. Thank you. Job done. And if we ever had any issues future, there was an email trail of the conversation and what we'd agreed and why we'd agreed it. And if there was any variance on that, we could just do it within an email. So that was all nice and easy. But there are, clearly there are then people coming through nowadays who are transitioning through different sexes. And we had that in the police a long time ago. I mean, 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, we had police officers doing that. So it's not something we're not used to. And, there's it's if you think it's difficult for you, try being in their shoes. If you think and I'm not pretending I found it easy. In fact, only last year I had somebody reply on a post of mine on LinkedIn, and I thought that person's implying they know me, but I haven't got a clue who that is. And it turns out it was a PC that we both joined the police together in the same class together at training school, and kind of kept in contact all through our police career. And then we were working together towards the end, and for whatever reason, he had to leave the organization. And unbeknown to me, had transitioned. And so now I was talking to the same person, but he was now a she. And, and I was thinking about me and how awkward it was for me. I wasn't really thinking about how awkward it was for her. And so I'm not from probably the generation that's maybe more used to or more understanding of some of these things. But that's because I always see it from my perspective rather than their perspective. And I think when you start doing that and you think, okay, this is awkward, I wonder how they feel.
Exactly.
This is going to be odd for the team. I wonder how they feel. I think, and that's the same, I think, with anything, if you're the only black person that works in your team, how does that feel for you? Because if you're the only white person working in a team of people from other cultures, put yourself in those shoes, feel how uncomfortable you might feel, how marginalized you might feel when they're talking about certain subjects. That's how they're feeling.
100%, yeah. Because I would always, we always encounter these situations, don't we? And very rarely do people who are racialized as white ever really have that experience of feeling like the only. It's not spaces that we find ourselves in very frequently, and it always blows my mind how we struggle, and I say we, speaking about myself, in that, you know, how to put yourself in the shoes of someone else when it's just not something that even occurs to you. And that's one of those tests, isn't it, of actually, you know, when it comes to power and privilege, it's like there's a really big clanging example of, if you hadn't even occurred to you to think to put yourself in another person's shoes, you're probably navigating life with a fair amount of privilege.
Yeah, and I'm a middle class white married man, so I'm as far away from the difference, if you like, than I can be. But it, you know, when we're kind of bringing the subject back to sort of threat and risk and all that, it's, you know, all these subjects start somewhere. And many of threat issues, when we look at some of the threats that we're dealing with, be it all sorts of different issues, they tend to start with some form of grievance.
Yeah.
And so we often look at grievance driven acts. That's kind of the behaviors that we look at. And so when we kind of roll back or reverse engineer the process, you know, grievance tends to start with some form of perceived injustice. It can be a real injustice, or it can be a perceived one. It doesn't actually matter, you know, because even if it's perceived, you've got to deal with it as perceived,
and it's real to that person, right?
Real to that person. So how do we deal with that perception that there is an injustice? Now, sometimes there is an injustice. And sometimes that's life, you know, you got to kind of get on with it. We can't always swim against the tide. There are times when we've all been treated unfairly. And life is not 100% fair. However much we want to write policies around it and all this sort of stuff, life is not always 100% fair. Sometimes somebody else gets promoted in front of you. Sometimes somebody gets a job that you wanted, or they get a sale that you want, you know, whatever. They get treated better than you want, you know. So that's just happens.
But to your point, it's the perception of fairness as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything's a perception.
Yeah. And so you may not know all the facts. You may not know all the details. But the point is, we understand. So we know then that within that injustice, there tend to be four kind of areas, which is blame, loss, anger, and humiliation. So those are the four kind of key areas that people generally feel when there's some form of injustice. I'm blaming someone for my injustice. I'm feeling this loss, so I'm not getting promoted, I'm not getting the pay, or I've been sacked, I've lost my job, I've lost my livelihood, I've lost my relationship. There's loss. There's anger. I'm angry about the fact I've lost this. I'm angry about the fact what's happened. And there's humiliation. And humiliation is probably the one that we can control, because the days of being escorted out the office with your cardboard box and a walk of shame as you leave the building for the last time, I can't imagine that ever happening, but I guess it probably still does.
I mean, I'm sure it does.
Yeah. And so that's humiliation. That's humiliating someone walking out. Judges and magistrates are told, when they're sentencing someone, don't humiliate them, because they're going to sit in a cell for the next 6 months or 6 years or whatever, thinking about that humiliation. And so don't be surprised if they come out and target you.
Yeah.
So it's the same way. If you're having that conversation with someone, if you're having, you know, if you are having to let somebody go, if someone's performance isn't good, you know, don't humiliate them, because that creates an injustice, a sense of injustice. That's one of the grievances occurs. And if we look at the most violent offences that go on, that are kind of work related, or some of these issues that are going on in the workplace, be it schools, colleges, universities. If we look at the American, when they get the mass shootings, it starts with a grievance or a perceived grievance. The whole incel movement, which is the involuntary celibate movement, which is predominantly men, but not exclusively, or young men, is this grievance. They're angry about the fact that they're being excluded. There is this loss of sexual activity. They're blaming what they call the Stacys, these girls that they perceive are looking down at them, and the Chads, which are these kind of, you know, athletes at school or what have you. And so when we look at when they go
humiliation, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, but when we look at when they go into attack at the most extreme end, they target the Chads and Stacys, because that's who they blame for how they feel, for their sense of injustice. So we can see this. We can see this in, you know, when I worked in the terrorist teams, and you saw the some of the stuff that's going on there with some of the lone actor terrorists. They all attribute it in their manifestos that they all want to tell us about now, and there's reasons for doing that. They all detail who they're blaming for what's going on. You've invaded our lands, you've treated us this way, you've done this, I've got this, I haven't got this. They're detailing what their grievances are. So when we're looking at the workplace and we're thinking about someone that is potentially escalating, is becoming a problem, we need to look at what their grievance is. Because the definition of a threat, or the component parts of a threat, are intent and capability. They have an intention to do something and the capability to do it. Well, the intention tends to be grievance driven. And the intention tends to go from being a grievance to a violent or problematic ideation because they can't resolve the grievance. So what they're saying is effectively I've had this grievance. There's no way for me to resolve it. I've tried everything. I've done everything. The only way to resolve it is through a different means. And that means being violent or being problematic or being whatever. So they go from being unresolved grievance into this ideation of violence or suicide or other behavior. Without that intent, you don't have a threat. So we are duty bound when we get a problem to think about, okay, what's their grievance? Let's write it down. Let's understand from them. Tell me what it is that you're upset about. Tell me what this injustice is, and actually listen. And don't just expect them to come out with it straight away. Whenever you're dealing with somebody, and this will go for victims and witnesses as well. Whenever you're dealing with someone who's got a very serious issue. So when I dealt with child abuse or dealt with serious sexual violence or other things, domestic violence was a good one actually as well. Another example. Very often they don't tell you what's going on first. They drip feed something small into the equation. And what they're seeing is, how are you going to respond to this? Are you going to take me seriously? And only when you do they then start to actually tell you the truth and tell you, actually, I've been raped. Or actually I'm being, abused at home, or actually there's honor-based violence in my house or whatever. They don't come in and say, oh, there's honor-based violence in my house, I'm going to get murdered. They'll come in and say, look, I'm being treated really badly, I'm not allowed out, or what have you. What are you going to do about it? And what's happened in the past very often is the police have dismissed someone because the low-level incident or the low-level report is not necessarily criminal. And they're not looking at the bigger picture, and therefore they're dismissing it as not my problem.
And what it's indicative of.
And then the same in the workplace. If someone's coming forward to complain about something that's happened and you're trivializing it, they're not going to tell you what's really happening.
And for me,
therefore you're not going to find out.
When you were saying the 4 key things, one of them being trust, right? So to me, that sounds like that's a trust test, isn't it? Like I'm literally testing the water to see, can I trust you to tell you the real thing?
And are you going to take me seriously? Or are you just going to dismiss it? Because I'm not going to expose myself by telling this really awful thing if you're not going to take me seriously when I tell you something trivial. And so we need to factor that in. And this is where, again, interviewing skills and what have you come into it, around understanding that process and understanding, okay, well, how do we actually extract better information? How do we gather information from someone who is vulnerable, who is problematic, who is all these things? When you've dealt with, children who have been abused and women that have been abused, you see certain body language. So you pick up on certain signs that they're not comfortable, they're not happy, they're not telling you everything. I've just written an article, and I'm probably going to publish it later on today, around Kanye West's partner, wife, whatever you want to call her. And you'll notice very often she holds a pillow in front of her when she's out and about, when she's not wearing much. And this is called shielding. And when you think about, have you ever watched a horror film at home? And it comes to the scary scene and you pick up a cushion because it comforts you, makes you feel comfortable.
It's like a physical barrier between you and the outside world.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And that's exactly what it is. It shields you from the threat, from the unpleasantness, the uncomfortableness, and it makes you feel comfortable. It's a shield in the same way as a shield is a shield. She does this quite regularly in different outfits. She's got this pillow in front of her. Now you will also see other people doing things like putting their arms across their chests,
Mm.
or sometimes you'll see Prince Charles when he plays with his cufflink across his
Mm.
chest. That's another form of shielding. So what you're looking at is comfort and discomfort, and you're
Mm.
trying to establish, are they uncomfortable here? Is something making, is it a person? Is it a thing? It's probably going to be the interview, because they're stressed. It's a stressful environment. It's an unnatural environment for people. So we have to find a baseline. And that's why when you're doing an interview with someone, it's got to be properly managed. You've got to go through the proper rapport building, which is about actually being interested, not just kind of asking a set of questions to look like you're interested. And you're going to see whether their behavior changes. Do they release that shield? Do they start opening up to you? There's a reason why it's called opening up to you. Do their body language change? And equally, when you ask certain questions, do they change again?
Mm.
So if you're saying you're talking about your boss, and you're talking about the, John in accounts and Brian in what have you, if every time you mention Brian, they do something, maybe Brian is the problem.
Mm.
So, it's about having this understanding of how people respond in stress environments, how people respond when they are victims of behavior that's anything from, intolerable up to threatening. Their body will respond, and some of that is unconscious. They don't even know they're doing it. It's our limbic brain, our survival mechanism kicking in. So we need to read these signs and understand whether it's safe to ask the next question, where we are going to,
Mm.
is it, have you just got a reel of questions you want to ask, or are you going to have a conversation with this person?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are lots of tactics around how do we understand when we've got a problem, how do we deal with it? They've got a grievance, they've got an injustice. Okay, well, how do we get them to reveal that to us? How do we read their body language so that we know they're actually communicating with us rather than holding something back? How do we
Yeah.
tell that they are actually comfortable or not? It's so much more skill than just,
Yeah.
you know, getting someone
And
in a room and saying, what's the problem?
yeah, exactly. And in listening to that, I can kind of imagine, like, if I was hearing this as a supervisor, kind of thinking, shit, I can't learn everything about humans' behavior. Like, that's really difficult. But I guess what we're also saying is we don't have to know everything about every human and typical behavior. You just need to know your people. And if you've got a team of 6 people, like, be open enough with your team to build those relationships, which you probably already have, to pay attention to their particular, like, body language and their particular, I don't know if quirks is the right word, but the way they respond and react in
Yes,
certain ways.
gestures. Yeah,
What's
yeah,
their, yeah, gestures, thank you, that's it. What's their normal, because there's no such thing as normal, right? But there will be their
yep, yep,
normal,
yep.
and notice that.
Yeah, it's about being observant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So are you noticing? Are you observing changes? And the truth is this: people will say, "Yeah, but I can't read body language." Oh, yes, you can, because that's exactly why you think something's different, or
Mm.
that's why you think he's a bit odd. I don't feel safe or comfortable with him, or that's why
Mm.
you think, you know, that person. I'm keeping clear of that person because they're a bit off today, or that's why you're having a conversation and you're thinking they're not listening to me, or they're not
Mm.
interested in what I'm saying. Because actually we unconsciously read each other's body language all the time.
Yeah.
We just don't necessarily compartmentalize it or categorize it and say, I knew he wasn't listening to me because his legs were facing away from me, and he wasn't, and he was, he was doodling and he was doing. We don't kind of sit down and think about, well, how did you know he wasn't listening to me, or what is it about him
Mm.
that makes you feel uncomfortable? So we don't detail that, but we unconsciously know it,
Yeah. Yeah, we
and
just say,
that's
like, we
about
get a
intuition.
vibe, right?
Yeah, intuition, right? So we have to
Yeah.
trust our intuition when we're dealing with women's safety, and kind of talking to women about safety. One of the number one things we talk about is intuition and trusting your
Mm.
intuition. Because if your intuition is telling you something's not right, something's changed, Sally in accounts, she's all of a sudden she's just gone very quiet. She's different. Why don't you ask her if she's okay? Because if you're noticing it, something's happening, and you've got to
Yeah.
trust your intuition.
Yeah.
And so there's obviously ways about doing that, but a lot of people try and make it all into rocket science and this kind of complex science, and it can
Mm.
get really complex if you get into the nuance of it. But actually, if you just trust your instincts around, recognizing that if someone is sitting in a certain way where their knees and that are pointing away from me, and their whole body's kind of leaning away from me, then they're probably not comfortable with me.
Yeah.
And so how do I go off the subject and talk about other stuff and see whether we can build some rapport and see and actually show some genuine interest in somebody rather than just going through a tick box of how are you today, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. No, really, how are you today?
Yeah,
Because I've been told I have to ask
yeah,
twice.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah, or I hear you've moved house recently. How's that going? All that sort of stuff.
yeah, yeah,
What sort of projects have you got on there? What's the number? What's the big thing? What you're looking at? What sort of color
yeah,
schemes you're going for? Actually show an interest. You'll notice their body language opening up to you.
yeah,
And once you start doing it, you start recognizing it.
yeah,
And so then it's about, okay, I now know there's no point me asking them about the big question while they're shielding and looking away
yeah.
and their body's moving away from me because they're not ready to talk to me. I've got to get them into a position where they're more open and they're more able to discuss with me. And that is all part of threat management.
And I can imagine as well, like, just because people will pick up on those things, it doesn't necessarily mean there is a problem to be managed either. It could just mean,
No.
like we were saying earlier, it could just mean someone's having a bit of an off day, or one thing has happened in their world that is really shifting their behavior, but it's not going to lead to anything significant. However, there might be something going on that could lead to something significant, and it's about tuning in and being able to, I guess, start to have a conversation about that and start to really open a dialogue so that if it does look like something's becoming a significant problem, that can be talked about, as in, this is the problem here, rather than it leading to, like you said, to then creating some sort of grievance that could go undiscussed. And I guess then it's about, I'm thinking about if you're again supervisors, people managers, then also knowing what are their next steps. So if they do kind of start the conversation with Sally because she's a bit off and she does reveal something that you're like, oh crap, I don't know how to deal with this. Like we have like signposting, don't we? And support, like, to just know if on the off chance someone does do it, who do I need to talk to, maybe in HR or occupational health or like or security, like who are some good people for me to know to go to for advice who can help me help Sally.
Yeah. And be honest with Sally and say, listen, thank you so much for sharing with me. I really appreciate it. What I need to do is take some advice because I'm not entirely sure how we can, how we can make sure we can look after the best way. They don't expect you to know everything.
Yeah.
They just expect you to care and listen.
Yeah.
But equally, we need to be thinking about, businesses. Ultimately, a business is about making money, right? That's the bottom line of a business. If it's not making money, it's a charity. So, or it's going under, one of the two. But if you don't deal with these issues, that impacts performance. Therefore, that impacts the bottom line. That's the motivation for a company. If it's not interested in its people, if it's only interested in its profits, that's still the motivation why you need to deal with this. Because it's your people that perform that make you money.
Yeah.
If they don't perform, if they end up in industrial tribunals, not only is it expensive, it takes up huge amounts of time of everyone. It's hugely stressful for everyone.
Yeah.
We know that when these toxic environments exist, the best employees leave because they're the ones that think I can go elsewhere and get a job. My own wife had that exact experience where she was getting treated appallingly and they didn't take it seriously. And they said, oh, it's a cultural issue. Your managers from Eastern Europe, that's just how they are. Well, okay, well, that may be a cultural thing, but that's not acceptable. You can't put bad behavior down to culture. So, good people leave and then you get left with the toxic people. And then what happens is if you get left with people at work who are unhappy, who are disgruntled, who got unresolved grievances, you then get insider threats because then people are not bothered about and are not necessarily malicious ones, but negligent insider threats. So they're not really bothered whether they open a link on an email because they don't really care about your company because you don't care about them.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you've got exposure to threats. They're the ones that will talk about stuff outside of work in the pub. They're the ones that will breach certain rules because they don't care about you because you don't care about them.
And that's the
So
critical thought, right?
there's
Isn't
lots
it?
of
You
good
don't care
reasons
about
to talk
them.
about it.
Yeah.
So why would they care about you? They're the ones that will, take a laptop home and do some work at home, but actually they're not bothered whether they actually, they don't put the security settings in. That's not my problem. That's your problem. So, this all pays into much bigger issues around the insider threat, around profitability, around performance. It's all around people. And so
Yeah.
if you're a good leader, the best leaders care about people
Yeah.
because they recognize it's the people that make the profits.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess removing the barriers that exist for all types of people as well, to make sure that those environments are safe, like psychologically and physically and emotionally safe for everybody to be present.
Yeah, and also it doesn't mean you can't sack people who are not performing, who are
Yeah.
just, not turning up and not performing, or are problems and don't respond or change their behaviors, or and we're not suggesting that we've got to suddenly accept bad behavior. Quite the
Yeah,
opposite.
sure.
What we're saying is we've got to deal with it. We can't just ignore it and say, oh, he's a problem, we'll get rid of him. And actually, maybe his problem
Yeah.
is resolvable, because how much have you spent recruiting him, training him, dealing with him, all that sort of stuff? Do you
Yeah.
really want to just discard that person when there may be a
Yeah.
position here where, can you imagine how more motivated and more loyal they might be if you actually listen and help them through this difficult
Absolutely.
phase in their time?
Absolutely. Do you know, in my life in HR, I have lost count of the amount of times where someone turns up at your desk and says, yeah, I need this person to go. I'm like, what have you done so far? Nothing. Right. So you've decided you've had enough, and now it's you think it's my problem to fix. You're in charge of them. It's your problem to fix by fixing it.
Yeah.
It's not, and the fix is not just, no, please replace them with someone else. I've had enough of
Yeah.
this. Like, that's a you thing. That's not a them thing.
Well,
And
I was, when I always find it so interesting how we get people who are really good performers, and so we promote them.
Mhm.
But actually, we get this kind of confused because they're really good performers at what they do. That doesn't mean they're really good managers.
Yeah.
Now, I forget, someone told me a company recently where they've got two streams. One is performance, one is management.
Yeah.
And so you can be a really brilliant performer and you get promoted, but without any management responsibilities,
Yeah.
because they're just giving you bigger projects all the time and more challenging goals, etc. And then there are other people who are not necessarily the performers, but they're brilliant managers. So
Mhm.
they're going to manage the people.
Yeah.
And so, because what often happens is performers have to go into a management stream to get promoted. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden they're doing something they're not very good at, they don't particularly enjoy, and they're not able to do what they were good at, which
Yeah.
was performing, which
Yeah.
was sales or whatever.
Yeah.
And I heard, I forget the name of the company, but this really enlightened perspective where they have these two streams where they
Yeah.
recognize some people are better managers than
Just
others.
total different skill sets, right? Technical competence and technical capability does not equal people skills. Like, and it doesn't. And I 100% think that's just a brilliant thing, because what I'm hearing and everything you're saying as well is, if you can be the type of people manager who is capable of having those smaller, quite challenging conversations with people about getting to know them, what do they like, what do they dislike, and handling all of that, you're probably going to be really well equipped to have the bigger, more difficult conversations when someone comes to you with something more significant. A, because you've got the relationship, but B, because you are the type of person who will lean into the difficult and uncomfortable conversation. And it comes back to what you were saying earlier about, oh, I recognize this is uncomfortable for me. How does it feel for them? And you can have an empathetic and yet focused conversation with
Mm,
someone about something that is probably quite difficult, because it's a
mm,
learned. I always argue that there is nothing soft about people skills. I know we always call it soft skills, don't we? Like people management. I'm like, they are the most
mm,
hard conversations anyone can ever. You sit down and have a conversation with someone about their terminal illness.
mm.
There's nothing soft about that.
No,
Like,
no. Or their partner's terminal illness, and all
yeah,
they've got to go through that.
exactly. It's
Yeah, yeah,
just,
yeah.
it's
And the other side of it
not.
is that when you are a people manager who leans in and takes on problems, don't be surprised if you get complaints as well.
Yeah,
And some of
totally.
those are going to be malicious complaints because you're going to be stopping people getting away with bad behavior. And so they are going to, um, their reprisal to you is to make a complaint about you, about bullying and all sorts of stuff. And this is where the investigation has to be professional,
Yeah.
because it has to be to identify, one of the biggest challenges of any investigation is bias,
Yes.
where someone goes into an investigation with a preconceived idea about what this is about and what the result is. Oh, someone's made an allegation of bullying, therefore there must be a bully. So I'm going to go into the investigation and prove the points for bullying. And we see this in policing when you first got young cops coming in, because in policing, there's a thing about legislation, and then you've got something called points to prove. So these are the points you have to prove for a case. So in theft, there are certain elements you have to have in order for theft to exist. So people would go into an investigation with these points to prove. I've got to prove these points. No, you haven't. You've got to go in there and fact find. You've got to go in there and actually understand what's happening. And within that, can you prove the points when if the person is guilty?
Once you've gathered.
So when you are a manager who does challenge people, you are probably going to get some malicious complaints about you, because you're disrupting people's easy life sometimes. And so when you do get those allegations, you want to also have the confidence that that investigation is going to be independent, and he's going to be unbiased, and he's going to look at the facts and understand, 150 people say this, you're a really great manager. One person saying you're bullying them. You might be bullying them, but let's look at it actually and think, actually, what does everyone else say about that individual? Is everyone else saying, actually, you know what, he's a piss taker? And I'm really glad the boss has taken him on, because we've all noticed he gets away with this, he gets away with that. So is there something more to it? So that's why this investigation piece of it needs to be open, transparent, and properly managed by someone who's a professional, who knows what they're doing in an investigation, not the HR manager or the security manager, unless they're properly equipped.
Yeah.
And equally,
and
going
also
on to
removed from that situation, right, as well.
Independent. But sometimes outside the organization, even, we go into companies and investigate, because that's what I spent 30 years investigating. So, that's a skill. But equally, there were times when I'd have members of my staff who were going through difficult things. And I would, sometimes it would be, look, I'm not sure I'm the best person to have this conversation with them, because I got a, funny feeling it might be a personal issue, or it might be something that you're really close to them. Can you have a conversation with them? Because actually you're probably better to have that conversation than I am. So it doesn't have to be you. If there's someone better that they're more likely to open up to that, they've already got an existing relationship with, then, use that. It's about fact finding. It's about understanding what's going on. It's about getting to the truth, not, no, I'm investigating this. You see people watch police programs and they all see like this the detective superintendent going into the interview to interview. I can tell you, no detective superintendent ever interviews anybody. That's not their job. It's the lower ranks that go in and do the interview, because that's what they do for a living. The managing director doesn't go and interview someone because he's the managing director. The HR director doesn't go and do an interview. Someone else does it who's better equipped and better qualified and the better person. And when you're going to interview suspects, you choose the right people to interview them. And it's the same with, witnesses, victims, even problematic people in the workplace. Who's best placed to actually conduct this investigation, to do the interview? Because ultimately that's what you're trying to get. You're trying to get the best result.
Yeah. And to me, that a lot of that sounds kind of an element of ego management in that, right? Of being able to again step outside of yourself, to kind of really be able to put some distance between how do you feel about what's going on versus what's the right thing to be happening right now. And just on something that you said as well, that kind of connected those dots, I was like, actually, we need to be prepared for people to raise things that we might, either about us or about situations that we might not want them to do. And I guess the first thing in that is knowing that actually there could well be something you will learn about yourself in that. So it might be a malicious complaint and it might be in support of you, but there also could be some feedback for you in there that will make you a better people manager as a result of having to listen to something uncomfortable. So like, yes, absolutely, it's malicious, we're not taking this any further. However, you can also learn something and kind of being open to that, because that's how we learn and grow, right? But then it also kind of made me think about, in organizations, I know that one of the fears I have, or organizations have when they work with me, is that, but if we start leaning into some of this stuff, everyone's going to start complaining because we're telling them that it's okay. And like, maybe they will. They're going to tell you. That's the thing.
And this is an example of why that's a good thing. So I get this all the time. I get, 80% of complaints or incidents are unreported. Well, hang on a minute. We don't want to, stir up a hornet's nest here. We don't want to open this barrel of stuff. We haven't got the capacity to deal with.
We love a can of worms. Okay. We don't want to open a can of worms.
Yeah, it's a can of worms. Yeah. Okay. So take a step back. So when I went into Parliament, one of the issues was lack of reporting around, this is post Joe Cox. So I go into Parliament to set up this team, one of the issues were that we were unaware and unsighted on all the issues that the politicians and all the threats the politicians were dealing with. So we had to get them to tell us stuff. And it was a case of a long process of saying, tell us everything. Within 10 months, the reporting got up 400%. So yeah, we had to increase our team. But we had to get better at what we were doing as well, because we knew that an awful lot of what they were telling us wasn't really threat material. And so we had to deal with it differently, or we had to manage our own processes. So we managed it better. But the reason an MP came forward to say, I think this is something you should know about, which ended up being a terrorist plot to kill another MP, was because we created this environment where they felt comfortable telling us everything. Now, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen in the workplace, but you don't know. You don't know that if you create this culture, somebody within your organization might come forward and say, do you know what, I've just heard so-and-so talking about something which I'm not sure about. That could be a major threat to your organization. It could be, insider threat. It could be someone planning an attack on your building because they're going to steal all the stuff. It could be all sorts of stuff. And it also could be there's a really bad bully here. Because if you look at some of the huge organizations in the UK, including, very well-known brands and business organizations, they've all had sudden influx of historical cases come forward, which has destroyed their reputation. The CEO is the one that gets sacked generally. But we also know that investors pull out because they don't want their reputation tarnished by being associated with you.
Yeah.
That all comes, if you don't do this properly and if you don't understand these things, that's what happens.
Yeah.
If you do create this transparent environment, yes, you're going to get more stuff coming forward, but you're going to get better at managing that as you do that process. And actually, you'll probably find that within that, there'll be some nuggets that are going to save your organization.
Yeah.
So what do you want? Do you want it all to be pretend it doesn't happen and all eventually comes out anyway and you get sacked as a CEO?
Yeah.
Or do you want to recreate an environment? Because I guarantee you, if you recreate the environment to be better, performance will go up, profits go up.
Yeah.
If you don't, you're always looking over your shoulder thinking, I wonder what's going on in the background. I wonder when it's going to, I guarantee something's going on. You just don't know about it. And at some point it'll bite you.
Yeah. So it sounds like basically people have got the choice to either be proactive about it or reactive. And one of them has much more devastating consequences than the other.
100%, 100%. And it happens. There's not an organization in the country that this isn't happening to at the moment, where there isn't a problem. Even if it's a tiny organization, there'll be some grievances around there about something around someone not getting a day off when they thought they should have got a day off, or whatever, not getting their bonus, not getting their commission when they thought they'd earned, whatever. There'll be something.
Yeah. By the very nature of people, right?
Yep. Right. Yep. So we either deal with it or we wait for the consequences.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be consequences. So you're going to be proactive, as you put it, or you're going to be reactive. There's no middle ground. It's one or the other. The reactive one is always more expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. Philip Grindell, thank you so much for this conversation today. Is there anything else that you would like to say to people that you haven't had the opportunity to say?
I think so. I mean, I think you're probably going to hopefully publish our details. If anyone wants to get in contact with us, that then they can do so through the details you'll publish, Casey. But I just think keep it simple. Don't think of threat management or risk management as this big scary subject that I'm not qualified in. We are a behavioural threat management company because it's about human behaviours. So trust your instincts, pick up those differences, have those conversations, and trust yourself, because you probably pick up more than you realise.
Fantastic. And you did mention there as well, so in what ways, because we will absolutely in the show notes put all of your contact details in there, but what kind of platforms can people find you on, and what ways is it best for people to connect with you?
Well, we're on LinkedIn, or I'm on LinkedIn anyway, so you can get me there, Philip Grindell, and I'm on there, whatever it is. I think I'm the only Philip Grindell on there, so that's pretty easy. Our website is diffuseglobal.com, and we're on Instagram. But if you want to get in touch, go on our website. There's areas there. We've got a weekly newsletter. We've got a monthly podcast, which brings some of the world's experts into the fore around all these various subjects. And I say, by all means, connect with me on LinkedIn and let's have conversations. That's really how we grow, by building relationships and have conversations.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better. That's the key theme, isn't it, here? Have conversations with people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. And build those relationships.
Philip, thank you so much for your time today. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you very much. I will do. You too.